In minutes the tunnel of the night closed upon the weak lanterns of our carriage, as if the village had never existed. We lurched forward, around a bend, the springs creaking, the dim moon revealing for an instant the pale outline of the mountains beyond the pines. I could not stop thinking of Morgan, stop hearing his voice. It was all tangled with my own horrified anticipation of meeting the thing which had killed Emily, the thing which was unquestionably one of our own. But Claudia was in a frenzy. If she could have driven the horses herself, she would have taken the reins. Again and again she urged me to use the whip. She struck savagely at the few low branches that dipped suddenly into the lamps before our faces, and the arm that clung to my waist on the rocking bench was as firm as iron. I remember the road turning sharply, the lanterns clattering, and Claudia calling out over the wind, "There, Louis, do you see it?" And I jerked hard on the reins. She was on her knees, pressed against me, and the carriage was swaying like a ship at sea. A great fleecy cloud had released the moon, and high above us loomed the dark outline of the tower. One long window showed the pale sky beyond it. I sat there, clutching the bench, trying to steady a motion that continued in my head as the carriage settled on its springs. One of the horses whinnied. Then everything was still. Claudia was saying, "Louis, come." I whispered something, a swift, irrational negation. I had the distinct and terrifying impression that Morgan was near to me, talking to me in that low, impassioned way he'd pleaded with me in the inn. Not a living creature stirred in the night around us. There was only the wind and the soft rustling of the leaves. "Do you think he knows we're coming?" I asked, my voice unfamiliar to me over this wind. I was in that little parlour, as if there were no escape from it, as if this dense forest were not real. I think I shuddered, and then I felt Claudia's hand very gently touch the hand I lifted to my eyes. The thin pines were billowing behind her, and the rustle of the leaves grew louder, as if a great mouth sucked the breeze and began a whirlwind. "They'll bury her at the crossroads. Is that what they'll do?" "An Englishwoman," I whispered. "Would that I had your size," Claudia was saying. "And would that you had my heart. Oh, Louis." And her head inclined to me now, so like the attitudes of the vampire bending to kiss that I shrank back from her. But her lips only gently pressed my own, finding a part there to suck the breath and let it flow back into me as my arms enclosed her. "Let me lead you," she pleaded. "There's no turning back now. Take me in your arms," she said, "and let me down, on the road." But it seemed an eternity that I just sat there feeling her lips on my face and on my eyelids. Then she moved. The softness of her small body suddenly snatched from me, in a movement so graceful and swift that she seemed now poised in the air beside the carriage, her hand clutching mine for an instant, then letting it go. And then I looked down to see her looking up at me, standing on the road in the shuddering pool of light beneath the lantern. She beckoned to me. As she stepped backwards, one small boot behind the other, "Louis, come down," until she threatened to vanish into the darkness. In a second I'd unfastened the lamp from its hook, and I stood beside her in the tall grass. "Don't you sense the danger?" I whispered to her. "Can't you breathe it like the air?" One of those quick, elusive smiles played on her lips as she turned towards the slope. The lantern pitched a pathway through the rising forest. One small white hand drew the wool of her cape close, and she moved forward. "Wait, only for a moment." "Fear's your enemy," she answered, but she did not stop. She proceeded ahead of the light, feet sure, even as the tall grass gave way gradually to low heaps of rubble, and the forest thickened, and the distant tower vanished with the fading of the moon and the great weaving of the branches overhead. Soon the sound and scent of the horses died on the low wind. "Be on guard," Claudia whispered as she moved relentlessly, pausing only now and again where the tangled vines and rocks made it seem for moments there was a shelter. But the ruins were ancient. Whether plague or fire or a foreign enemy had ravaged the town, we couldn't know. Only the monastery truly remained. Now something whispered in the dark that was like the wind in the leaves, but it was neither. I saw Claudia's back straighten, saw the flash of her white palm as she slowed her step. Then I knew it was water, winding its way slowly down the mountain, and I saw it far ahead through the black trunks, a straight moonlit waterfall descending to a boiling pool below. Claudia emerged silhouetted against the fall, her hand clutching a bare root in the moist earth beside it, and now I saw her climbing hand over hand up the overgrown cliff, her arm trembling ever so slightly, her small boots dangling, then digging in to hold, then swinging free again. The water was cold, and it made the air fragrant and light all around it, so that for a moment I rested. Nothing stirred around me in the forest. I listened, senses quietly separating the tune of the water from the tune of the leaves, but nothing else stirred. And then it struck me gradually, like a chill coming over my arms and my throat and finally my face, that the night was too desolate, too lifeless. It was as if even the birds had shunned this place, as well as all the myriad creatures that should have been moving about the banks of this stream. But Claudia, above me on the ledge, was reaching for the lantern, her cape brushing my face. I lifted it so that suddenly she sprang into light, like an eerie cherub. She put her hand out for me as if, despite her small size, she could help me up the embankment. In a moment we were moving on again, over the stream, up the mountain. "Do you sense it?" I whispered. "It's too still." But her hand tightened on mine, as if to say, "Quiet." The hill was growing steeper, and the quiet was unnerving. I tried to stare at the limits of the light, to see each new bark as it loomed before us. Something did move, and I reached for Claudia, almost pulling her sharply near me. But it was only a reptile, shooting through the leaves with a whip of his tail. The leaves settled, but Claudia moved back against me, under the folds of my cape, a hand firmly clasping the cloth of my coat, and she seemed to propel me forward, my cape falling over the loose fabric of her own. Soon the scent of the water was gone, and when the moon shone clear for an instant I could see right ahead of us what appeared to be a break in the woods. Claudia firmly clasped the lantern and shut its metal door. I moved to stop this, my hand struggling with hers, but then she said to me quietly, "Close your eyes for an instant, and then open them slowly, and when you do, you will see it." A chill rose over me as I did this, during which I held fast to her shoulder. But then I opened my eyes and saw beyond the distant bark of the trees the long, low walls of the monastery, and the high, square top of the massive tower. Far beyond it, above an immense black valley, gleamed the snow-capped peaks of the mountains. "Come," she said to me, "quiet, as if your body has no weight." And she started without hesitation right towards those walls, right towards whatever might have been waiting in their shelter. In moments we found the gap that would admit us, the great opening that was blacker still than the walls around it, the vines encrusting its edges as if to hold the stones in place. High above, through the open roof, the damp smell of the stones strong in my nostrils, I saw, beyond the streaks of the cloud, a faint sprinkling of stars. A great staircase moved upwards, from corner to corner, all the way to the narrow windows that looked out upon the valley, and beneath the first rise of the stair, out of the gloom emerged the vast, dark opening to the monastery's remaining rooms. Claudia was still now, as if she had become the stones in the damp enclosure. Not even the soft tendrils of her hair moved. She was listening, and then I was listening with her. There was only the low backdrop of the wind. She moved, slowly, deliberately, and with one pointed foot gradually cleared a space in the moist earth in front of her. I could see a flat stone there, and it sounded hollow as she gently tapped it with her heel. Then I could see the broad size of it, and how it rose at one distant corner, and an image came to mind, dreadful in its sharpness, of that band of men and women from the village surrounding the stone, raising it with a giant lever. Claudia's eyes moved over the staircase, and then, fixed on the crumbling doorway beneath it, the moon shone for an instant through the lofty window. Then Claudia moved so suddenly that she stood beside me without having made a sound. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. "Listen." It was so low no mortal could have heard it. And it did not come from the ruins. It came from far off. Not that long meandering way that we had come up the slope, but another way, up the spine of the hill, directly from the village. Just a rustling now, a scraping, but it was steady, and then slowly the round tramping of a foot began to distinguish itself. Claudia's hand tightened on mine, and with a gentle pressure she moved me silently beneath the slope of the stairway. I could see the folds of her dress heave slightly beneath the edge of her cape. The tramp of the feet grew louder, and I began to sense that one step preceded the other very sharply, the second dragging slowly across the earth. It was a limping step, drawing nearer and nearer over the low whistling of the wind. My own heart beat hard against my chest, and I felt the veins in my temples tighten, a tremor passing through my limbs, so that I could feel the fabric of my shirt against me, the stiff cut of the collar, the very scraping of the buttons against my cape. Then a faint scent came to me on the wind. It was the scent of blood, at once arousing me, against my will, the warm scent of human blood, blood that was spilled, flowing. And then I sensed the smell of living flesh, and I heard in time with the feet a dry, hoarse breathing. But with it came another sound, faint and intermingled with the first, as the feet tramped closer and closer to the walls, the sound of yet another creature's halting, strained breath. And I could hear the heart of that creature, beating irregularly, a fearful throbbing, but beneath that was another heart, a steady, pulsing heart growing louder and louder, a heart as strong as my own. Then, in the jagged gap through which we'd come, I saw him. His great, huge shoulder emerged first, and one long, loose arm and hand, the fingers curved. Then I saw his head. Over his other shoulder he was carrying a body. In the broken doorway he straightened and shifted the weight and stared directly into the darkness towards us. Every muscle in me became iron as I looked at him, saw the outline of his head looming there against the sky, but nothing of his face, as if it were a fragment of glass. Then I saw it glint on his buttons and heard them rustle as his arm swung free again, and one long leg bent as he moved towards us and proceeded into the tower as he moved forward and proceeded into the tower right towards us. I held fast to Claudia, ready in an instant to shove her behind me, to step forward to meet him. But then I saw him astonished that his eyes did not see me as I... But then I saw with astonishment that his eyes did not see me as I saw him, and he was trudging under the weight of the body as he carried it towards the monastery door. The moon fell now on his bowed head, on a mass of wavy black hair that touched his bent shoulder, and on the full black sleeve of his coat. I saw something about his coat. The flap of it was badly torn, and the sleeve appeared to be ripped from the seam. I almost fancied I could see his flesh through the shoulder. The human in his arms stirred now, and moaned miserably, and the figure stopped for a moment and appeared to stroke the human with his hand, and at that moment I stepped forward from the wall and went towards him. No words passed my lips. I knew none to say. I only knew that I moved into the light of the moon before him, and that his dark, wavy head rose with a jerk, and that I saw his eyes. For one full instant he looked at me, and I saw the light shining in those eyes, and then glinting on two sharp canine teeth. And then a low strangled cry seemed to rise from the depths of his throat, which, for a second, I thought to be my own. The human crashed to the stones, a shuddering moan escaping his lips, and the vampire lunged at me, that strangled cry rising again as the stench of fetid breath rose in my nostrils, and the claw-like fingers cut into the very fur of my cape. I fell backwards, my head cracking against the wall, my hands grabbing at his head, clutching a mass of tangled filth that was his hair. At once the wet, rotting fabric of his coat ripped in my grasp, but the arm that held me was like iron, and as I struggled to pull the head backwards, the fangs touched the flesh of my throat. Claudius screamed behind him. Something hit his head hard, which stopped him suddenly, and then he was hit again. He turned as if to strike her a blow, and I sent my fist against his face so powerfully as I could. Again a stone struck him as she darted away, and I threw my full weight against him and felt his crippled leg buckling. I remember pounding his head over and over, my fingers all but pulling that filthy hair out by the roots, his fangs projected towards me, his hands scratching, clawing at me. We rolled over and over, until I pinned him down again and the moon shone full on his face, and I realized through my frantic sobbing breaths what it was I held in my arms. The two huge eyes bulged from naked sockets, and two small hideous holes made up his nose. Only a putrid leathery flesh enclosed his skull, and the rank rotting rags that covered his frame were thick with earth and slime and blood. I was battling a mindless, animated corpse, but no more. From above him a sharp stone fell full on his forehead, and a fount of blood gushed from between the eyes. He struggled, but another stone crashed with such force I heard the bones shatter. Blood seeped out beneath the matted hair, soaking into the stones and grass. The chest throbbed beneath me, but the arms shuddered and grew still. I drew up, my throat knotted, my heart burning, every fibre of my body aching from the struggle. For a moment the great tower seemed to tilt, but then it righted itself. I lay against the wall, staring at the thing, the blood rushing in my ears. Gradually I realized that Claudia knelt on his chest, that she was probing the mass of hair and bone that had been his head. She was scattering the fragments of his skull. We had met the European vampire, the creature of the old world. He was dead. For a long time I lay on the broad stairway, oblivious to the thick earth that covered it, my head feeling very cool against the earth, just looking at him. Claudia stood at his feet, hands hanging limply at her sides. I saw her eyes close for an instant, two tiny lids that made her face like a small, moonlit white statue as she stood there. And then her body began to rock very slowly. "Claudia," I called to her. She awakened. She was gaunt, such as I had seldom seen her. She pointed to the human who lay far across the floor of the tower near the wall. He was still motionless, but I knew that he was not dead. I'd forgotten him completely, my body aching as it was, my senses still clouded with the stench of the bleeding corpse. But now I saw the man, and in some part of my mind I knew what his fate would be, and I cared nothing for it. I knew it was only an hour at most before dawn. "He's moving," she said to me, and I tried to rise off the steps. Better that he not wake, better that he never wake at all, I wanted to say. She was walking towards him, passing indifferently the dead thing that had nearly killed us both, I saw her back and the man stirring in front of her, his foot twisting in the grass. I don't know what I expected to see as I drew nearer, what terrified peasant or farmer, what miserable wretch that had already seen the face of that thing that had brought it here, and for a moment I did not realize who it was that lay there, that it was Morgan, whose pale face showed now in the moon, the marks of the vampire on his throat, his blue eyes staring mute and expressionless before him. Suddenly they widened as I drew close to him. "Louis," he whispered in astonishment, his lips moving as if he were trying to frame the words but could not. "Louis," he said, and then I saw he was smiling. A dry, rasping sound came from him as he struggled to his knees, and he reached out for me. His blanched, contorted face strained as the sound died in his throat, and he nodded desperately, his red hair loose and dishevelled, falling into his eyes. I turned and ran from him. Claudia shot past me, grasping me by the arm. "Do you see the colour of the sky?" she hissed at me. Morgan fell forward on his hands behind her. "Louis," he called out again, the light gleaming in his eyes. He seemed blind to the ruins, blind to the night, blind to everything but a face he recognized, that one word again issuing from his lips. I put my hands to my ears, backing away from him. His hand was bloody now as he lifted it. I could smell the blood as well as see it, and Claudia could smell it too. Swiftly she descended on him, pushing him down against the stones, her white fingers moving through his red hair. He tried to raise his head. His outstretched hands made a frame about her face, and then suddenly he began to stroke her yellow curls. She sank her teeth, and the hands dropped helpless at his side. I was at the edge of the forest when she caught up with me. "You must go to him. Take him," she commanded. I could smell the blood on her lips, see the warmth in her cheeks. Her wrist burned against me, yet I did not move. "Listen to me, Louis," she said, her voice at once desperate and angry. "I left him for you, but he's dying. There's no time." I swung her up into my arms and started the long descent. No need for caution, no need for stealth, no preternatural host waiting. The door to the secrets of Eastern Europe was shut against us. I was ploughing through the dark to the road. "Will you listen to me?" she cried out. But I went on in spite of her, her hands clutching at my coat, my hair. "Do you see the sky? Do you see it?" she railed. She was all but sobbing against my breast as I splashed through the icy stream and ran headlong in search of the lantern at the road. The sky was a dark blue when I found the carriage. "Give me the crucifix," I shouted to Claudia as I cracked the whip. "There's only one place to go." She was thrown against me as the carriage rocked into its turn and headed for the village. I had the eeriest feeling then as I could see the mist rising amongst the dark brown trees. The air was cold and fresh and the birds had begun. It was as if the sun were rising, yet I did not care. And yet I knew that it was not rising, that there was still time. It was a marvelous, quieting feeling. The scrapes and cuts burned my flesh, and my heart ached with hunger, but my head felt marvelously light. Until I saw the grey shapes of the inn and the steeple of the church. They were too clear, and the stars above were fading fast. In a moment I was hammering on the door of the inn. As it opened, I put my hood up around my face tightly and held Claudia beneath my cape in a bundle. "Your village is rid of the vampire," I said to the woman, who stared at me in astonishment. I was clutching the crucifix, which she'd given me. "Thanks be to God, he's dead. You'll find the remains in the tower. Tell this to your people at once." I pushed past her into the inn. The gathering was roused into commotion instantly, but I insisted that I was tired beyond endurance. I must pray and rest. They were to get my chest from the carriage and bring it to a decent room where I might sleep. But a message was to come for me from the Bishop of at Varna, and for this, and this only, was I to be awakened. Tell the good father when he arrives that the vampire is dead, and then give him food and drink and have him wait for me, I said. The woman was crossing herself. You understand, I said to her, as I hurried towards the stairs. I couldn't reveal my mission to you until after the vampire had been... Yes, yes, she said to me. But you are not a priest. The child. No, only too well versed in these matters. The unholy one is no match for me, I said to her. I stopped. The door of the little parlour stood open, with nothing but a white square of cloth on the oak table. Your friend, she said to me, and she looked at the floor. He rushed out into the night. He was mad. I only nodded. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, that is another little section of Interview with the Vampire. What are some of the cool things that we have today going on? The first thing I have noted down here is a recurrent note on Louis and Claudia's relationship, because I think I just need to bring this up a little bit again with what happens over this scene. And I observe that it seems that the only time, or the primary time, that Claudia shows affection, particularly physical affection, towards Louis is whenever his devotion appears to be wavering, or he doubts her judgment, or it appears like he's not 100% going along with whatever her plan is. She appears to use this affection in order to reaffirm her hold over him and basically bring him back, on side. And I'm pretty settled into my reading of Claudia as manipulating Louis and using her hold over him as a manipulation tool rather than her actually feeling these affections, for two reasons. The first is that if you've listened to the analysis thus far in this series, it's the most convincing to me, and I think I've given quite a few reasons as to why that is the case. But the second is that the alternative is not really something I'm comfortable with being in a book like this. It's not really something I want to read about too much, and it is just a bit iffy to me, really. That's an understatement, I suppose. If Claudia is actually feeling this way about Louis, it has these very, very pedophilic vibes that are even worse than the deeply pedophilic vibes already that given off by the relationship. The notion of Louis' feelings being reciprocated rather than taken advantage of for survival purposes. It presents this notion of their relationship having any form of emotional legitimacy, I suppose. And I think if we treat the relationship as something legitimate and as something even wholesome or good, then we're treading dangerous territory. Even though she is technically 100 and something years old, probably 70 something years old right now. I don't know. It's still not okay in my view, and so that's why I go with that reading. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support the reading of Claudia that I go with, and I think it improves her character a great deal to go with it. Regardless, let's talk about the Eastern European vampire that we meet in this little section. So the main thing to note about the Eastern European vampire, which is said about it, and it's very obvious, is that it's more of a walking corpse, a kind of shambling revenant, kind of zombie-ish figure that drains blood and steals villagers and that kind of thing, as opposed to the more subtle, socially manipulative vampire of the West that seems to have come out of the Western world, that would be the kind that Louis, Lestat, and Claudia are. And this depiction of the Eastern European vampire is, first of all, as I understand it, more typical of ancient vampire folklore, where they would more be these kind of creatures in the wilderness that'll lure you away and eat you, as opposed to being something that goes through the aristocratic circles of society, preying on people, as the Western depiction would imagine them. And what I think is mainly interesting about the Eastern European vampire in regards to the story of Interview with the Vampire is that it canonizes and creates this inherent racial hierarchy within vampiredom, the vampire species. These Eastern European vampires appear to be to Louis and Claudia what a chimpanzee would be to a human. A kind of more primitive, underdeveloped version of themselves. And this is kind of worrying when taken in the context that vampires are, of course, all originally people. And it feels like this reflection of the Eastern European vampires as these mindless, bloodthirsty creatures has some reflection in the story from the part of the world they come from. There is, for some reason, this part of the world is inhabited by mindless vampires, but the Western world is inhabited by very, very smart vampires. This is one of the few, I think, good retcons that the later novels go with, where they get rid of this very, very problematic and covertly racist notion that the smart vampires have all come out of Western Europe, whereas the vampires in Eastern Europe are all mindless, just blood-sucking creatures. So it's a bit of a clumsy depiction here. I don't think it's very well executed, but it's still interesting. It's still interesting to look at. And if anything, it does just reaffirm this notion of Louis being sorry, no, that's a bit later, actually. But it'll make sense. There is... So I read a note that was later down my page as I was talking, and it threw me off. But... this notion of it being a reflection on race. There's a very iffy line about this coming up later that will allow me more of an opportunity to talk about, and those of you who have read the book before can already guess at what that line is, but it's a big one. Another point I have here is that it's a bit confusing to me how Morgan managed to beat Louis and Claudia to the monastery, despite the fact he was still there when they left by carriage. But it doesn't bother me too much, because I suppose he did run off into the night like a madman, and vampires can move with supernatural speed. So I'm just assuming that the Eastern European vampire grabbed him, picked him up, ran away with him. Makes sense. The main thing to note in regards to Morgan here is because Louis is thinking about Morgan as he travels. And it's interesting to see how Louis is getting really upset, even after he's left the village. He's getting upset to himself at this notion of the Englishman being subjected to the superstitious behaviors of these villagers. He's getting really, really annoyed at the fact that they're going to, bury his wife at the crossroads and cut off her head and drive a stake through her heart. Which is, I suppose, uncharacteristic for him at this stage, and I went into a bit of detail about that last episode. But I think my main point in regards to this is it just kind of reaffirms that Louis is a bit of a racist. He's always going to side with the characters that are familiar to his aristocratic Western European upbringing over anyone else, and he's always going to see the world exactly as they do. He is a vampire, and he knows that vampires don't work how they think they work. But he probably could... First of all, he learns a bit later that these vampires don't work exactly the same as he does to begin with. But also there's just the the fact that he could probably cut these villagers a little bit of slack, especially when he was previously praising their supposed superstitious ability to identify vampires as good. It goes back on this notion of their superstition being good. It appears that their superstition is universally flawed and incapable of actually dealing with the vampires. They need Louis, the smart Western vampire, to come in and actually deal with the situation. So that's interesting. Another cool thing, that was also the point that I accidentally read earlier, and it confused me. Sorry about that. Another cool point is that Louis, at the very, very end of this little section, we have Louis posing as a religious vampire hunter in order to gain shelter for the day. I love this little scene. He just comes back. He speech 100s himself. Goes, I'm waiting for a letter from the bishop. Don't wake me up. It's a very bold move, a bold move indeed. But to be fair, it is a necessary one to avoid the sunrise. They have to do something, or else they're done for. And for the sake of the story, I'm completely fine with this, with him getting away with it. This one in this instance. But the really interesting thing to consider is that time and time again, Louis either places himself within religious roles or is placed in religious roles by other characters. Lestat made him play the role of a priest. He considered himself an angel. Lestat referred to him as a dark angel. He considers himself a devil. Bet has called him a devil. And so this religious costuming is almost being placed on him time and time again throughout the story, and he reacts like a religious vampire hunter in order to gain refuge. And I think that's an interesting narrative point, and my kind of justification for this narratively and thematically that I think works kind of well is the fact that in much the same way that Louis uses a religion he does not truly believe in as a lens for his worldview. Everything he thinks about in regards to his condition is referenced back to religion and God and the afterlife, except he doesn't truly believe or practice in these things, and he is filled with doubt about them, so he cannot fully practice this religion he kind of half believes in, half doesn't believe in. In the same way that is true, he has these religious roles he does not belong in placed over his character. And whilst he acts these roles out, he is incapable of fully completing them. There's always something imperfect about his depiction of them. He can't play the priest when Lestat wants him to because he's not capable of actually comforting the woman properly. He is not able to play the angel because he makes the situation worse. He's not able to play the devil, the dark angel, because he is too concerned with his own humanity and morality. He's not able to play the vampire hunter the religious vampire hunter properly, because he is both a vampire and the religious symbolism does nothing against vampires. So that's interesting thematically. I think it's an interesting reflection upon his worldview in the roles he is forced to make. And there's definitely some cool thematic stuff to go with that. But anyway, that's my analysis for today. Sorry I got a bit scattered in the middle there, but I hope everything came out all right. I hope you enjoyed that section, and I'll be back again tomorrow with another little segment of Interview with the Vampire. So I'll see you then.